pastoral mode of adaptation is one of the earliest ways of subsistence known in human evolution. When human beings became Homo sapiens, initially they were only acquiring whatever was ready-made from the environment, which was known as foraging. At that point of time, which covers almost the entire span of our existence as Homo sapiens, hunting of wild animals was the predominant way of getting animal products. But a pastoral mode depends upon the knowledge of animal husbandry. So, somewhere along the path of evolution, humans started to adopt and rear the wild animals, creating herds of animals which were linked to their habitats. So, these animals were not wild, they were bred in captivity or semi-captivity. They were cared for, fed, and looked after by these pastoral people who are defined as pastoral on the basis not only of the domestication of animals, but also because their way of life, the human way of life, the way of life of these particular communities was adapted to the needs of the animals. This is a very important dimension of definition of pastoral economy, because as we know, modern farming is also domesticates animals. But that level of technology and the nature of the relationship to the animals is only as resource. As we know, they are bred and used in a very mechanical kind of a way. But in a pastoral economy, the animals are part of the human society. In fact, they are the more important part of human society than even the humans. For example, amongst the Todas of Nilgiris, the cattle that they breed, they are considered as sacred. The place where they keep the animals, the cattle sheds, are their temples. So we see that the animals are not only part of society, they are often part of the sacred complex, and they kind of dictate the way the humans are going to live. And pastoral adaptation is common in arid and semi-arid regions, and the emphasis is on the requirements of the animals, that is, there should be plenty of water and fodder and conducive climate. The kind of climate that is going to make the animals comfortable. And for this reason, sometimes and quite often in fact, the pastoral people are either nomadic or transhumant. Also, the kind of species that is domesticated depends upon the nature of the habitat. Some habitats are conducive to the domestication of smaller species, like all along the Himalayan mountain ranges, we have sheep and goat breeders. Communities like the Bhotiyas, the Gaddis, the Bakarwals, they are dependent upon sheep and goat breeding and all associated economic activities that are related to these animals. For example, all these communities deal with wool and all the products that can be made out of wool. For example, carpets, clothes, sweaters, and even the wool itself. And they also sell the wool. But very rarely are pastoral economists or pastoral people dependent upon the meat of the animals. They don't eat the animals that they rear, because as I have already explained, these are part of their own society. They are often considered sacred. And although the bakarwals and the bhotias eat meat sometimes, but they procure the animal from outside. They don't kill anybody in their herd. Now, as we have seen these Himalayan pastoral economies, the mountain habitat is generally conducive to the domestication of small animals. But if we look into the desert lands, entire Middle East, and also in our country, Rajasthan, we have, or and Gujarat, the whole entire Kutch area, the desert area is very adaptable to domestication of the animals that are specific to this particular habitat, that is the camel and also horses. So horse and camel are found all over these arid deserts, but where there is provision for enough water, because water is the lifeline of, as we know, all life, and the large animals need a lot of water. And therefore, these communities also had knowledge of preservation of water. The Bauris in Rajasthan, they have a lot of ways of preserving rainwater and technologies of water usage. And then North American prayer was at one time, now of course this is all city, it is an urbanized, completely urbanized terrain. But at one time, before the colonization by the European, the North American prairies, these were rolling grasslands, and they were famous for the famous North American buffalo, which have now almost become extinct, plus the horse riding tribes. In fact, there were entire, you can say, countries that were pursuing the pastoral economy. The Middle East was comprised of mostly tribes, pastoral nomadic tribes, which were competing with each other for the grasslands, for the water and the animals. So they also developed a culture of conflict. And the Mongols and the Huns of medieval times, they were domesticating horses, and horses provided mobility. Unlike the settled cultivators who were not mobile, many of these pastoral nomads who were domesticating large animals which could be used for locomotion, especially horses and camels, they could move long distances and they could also attack and raid. So they also became quite predatory. And if you look into history, you will note that the Mongols and Huns were highly predatory cultures which constantly raided and engaged in warfare. Those who know something about Indian history would know about Genghis Khan and Timur Lenk, who were from these communities, who came all the way from the Central India, Central Asian plateaus to India to loot and raid. And they, because of their mobility, they could loot, raid, and then go away. They would not stay in one place. So they never settled down as such. Their aim was only to raid and then take away. But the communities that are based upon the domestication of small animals are peaceful, and they just engage in wool rearing, making carpets, and trading. So these are some of the, and again a very well-known pastoral community in India were the Todas of Nilgiri, who domesticated a particular variety of buffaloes known as Toda buffaloes. Many agricultural communities also practice animal husbandry. That is where we know also that all over northwest India there is the there's buffalo, domestication of buffalo plays a very important role in the economy of the agriculturalist in that region. And buffalo milk is a very common product which is sold and also consumed all over northern and northwestern Indian. But they cannot be called pastoral economies because their main subsistence is agriculture, and they are settled in the sense that their way of life is around agriculture rather than around the animals. The animals are domesticated, they are tied down at home, they are not left. Like if you look at the Todas or the Middle Eastern pastoral economies, the animals are herded, but they are not tied to the homesteads. They are kept in their pens and in their areas where they graze, and they are much in terms of demography, the number of animals far outnumbers the number of humans who take care of them. Like amongst the Bhotiyas, a family household can own up to several hundreds of animals, whereas the family number of family members would not be more than 10 or 8 or something like that, like a normal household. But the number of animals far outnumbers the number of humans. And that is also one of the reasons that we call them pastoral, because that is where their life is centered. Now, a pastoral economy does not produce any consumable grain, what we call as carbohydrates, what are very important for consumption, human consumption, the staple grains like rice, wheat, etc. That is not part of the pastoral economy. So where do they get it? Because they don't normally, none of the pastoral people eat the animals. They just rear them and use their various products, but they are not part of the food. So for food, they need to do trade, or they can have a mixed economy. And that is why we have included the concept of shifting cultivation or horticulture also in this particular lecture, because many times in a mixed economy, pastoral and horticulture go together. But this is only possible where where the habitat permits it. Like for example, in the East African cattle belt, in where you have this kind of mixed economy practiced by the tribes there, like the Tiv, the Nuers, the Dinkas and others, the Ashanti. But in India, we do not have any such mixed economy practicing pastoral community. All of them depend on trade and exchange with other communities for their staple requirements of food. Now, aesthetically and religiously also, the pastoral communities are, their cognitive world, their cognitive map is centered around their animals. Like amongst the Nuers, who are a very well described cattle rearing community of Africa, it was described and it was told by Vance Pritchard, who studied them, that even their colors, their aesthetics, like if a Nuer is talking about beauty, he will talk of beauty in terms of the beauty of animals. When they are describing colors, they will talk about colors in the shades of the animals. Now, for example, time. Now, in my own work on the Bhotiyas of Upper Himalayas, I found that their entire year is divided according to the movement of their animals. So the 4 parts of the year depend upon when the animals are going up, when the animals are coming down, when the animals are going into the lower pastures, when the animals are coming up into the village again. And like that, when it is time to shear the animals, in that sense, and even the day is likewise divided according to the movement of the animals, when it is time to milk the animals, when it is time for them to go grazing, when it is time for them to come back. And in their language, we will find that there will be many more words related to animals. Just like the Nuers, they describe color, aesthetics, beauty, and all kinds of adjectives which are used to describe, like we say, fast as a deer. And so they will use their animal symbolism only in their language to a very large extent. And similarly, gender relations are also very much dependent on this pastoral economic lifestyle. Like I was discussing, and I told you that the communities that domesticate very large animals like horses and camels were also had a culture of raiding and warfare. And when they used to raid other such similar communities for their animals, they would also take away the women. So that in these communities, there was a lot of restriction placed on women. And they were often not allowed to go out, and they were kept inside, because there was always a danger that whenever there was warfare or raid, the women would also be taken away. But in the communities like the Bhotiyas and the Gaddis on the upper Himalayas, it's just the opposite. Here, what happens is that they live in settled villages, and the animals are taken for grazing all along the mountain routes by the men, so that the men spend most of their time outside of the villages, and the village is practically controlled and ruled by the women. In their cognition, in their worldview, they say that the village or society belongs to women and the wild belongs to the men. So, and again, because they have to adjust to the life of these animals, the animals cannot stay in one place for too long. Because when, supposing they are taken to the pastures for grazing, even no matter how lush the pastures are, in 1 or 2 months, practically maximum by 3 months, all the grass is going to get depleted. So they need to move on. Similarly, water gets polluted, the animals bathe in it, they wade in it, so they have to keep moving on. Now these Bhotiyas, they go along the canals or the waterways on the Himalayan upper regions, taking their animals on these ways, and that is their route. That then becomes the pastoral nomadic route. Then climate plays a very important role. Now, in the Himalayas, for example, the upper reaches of the Himalayas, which is their main villages and where they spend about 6 months of the year, and that is where on the alpine pastures or over the tree line, there is beautiful fodder. So in summer, the animals graze on those alpine pastures, but in winter, the entire place gets covered in snow. So the animals cannot survive. So they are taken down to lower altitude pastures like near Rishikesh and Haridwar, and they graze there for 3 months, and then they go up back to their high altitude village by the time it is summer. So this kind of a movement which takes place between two fixed points, that is the upper altitude pastures and the lower altitude pastures, is called as transhumance. Transhumance is defined as movement between two fixed points, either upper altitude, lower altitude, which is very common in the mountain regions, but the Todas have another kind of transhumance. The Todas live on the top of the Nilgiris. Now, the Nilgiris are a mountain system, and when the monsoons come, there is a rain shadow area, as many of you know geography. There is a rain shadow area that is a side of the mountain where the rain falls very moderately, and then there is the side of the mountain where the rain is very heavy. Now the buffaloes that are reared by the Todas, they will not survive on the heavy rain side, because that is the animals cannot live in flooded areas. They get disease, they die, and they can slip, they can fall, they can drown. So the Todas move to the other side of the mountain, to the rain shadow area during the monsoon period. So this is also a kind of transhumance. But nomadism is like the camel herders, the horse breeders. They are nomadic because they have a large area. Like the North American plains was an entire grassland, rolling prairies they were called, and they would move from point to point, not going beyond a region, because each community or each tribe, whatever we want to call them, has its area of jurisdiction, that these are the area into which we can move. But within that area, they can move any way they like, and that is we call as a nomadic way of life. So either the pastorals are nomadic or they are transhuman, but they cannot settle in one place. At least the animals cannot settle. So there can be again two kinds of communities. The smaller ones, like the Bakarwals, for example, they move as a community. The entire village moves, and they move in tents. So they live in tents, and they park their tents in different places according to the needs of the animals. Whereas some others, like the Bhotiyas and the Todas, they have their settled villages, permanent villages, and only some people, always the men, who take the animals and move. So the women and children and some men, they remain back in the village, and the village life is controlled by them. And the village life moves parallel to the life of the nomadic tribesmen. The pastoral and also people cannot live, they cannot have a very high or dense populations, because they have to compete with the needs of the food needs of the animals. And what is food for the animals is not food for the humans. Sometimes what happens, like it is very common in central India, and it was also common in Rajasthan at one point of time, when technology had not developed so much so that the farmers or the agriculturalists, the cultivators, could have several cycles of cultivation. So they used to do monocropping. Monocropping means only when the conditions were conducive, like during the rainy season, they would plant their crops, and the rest of the year the land used to lie fallow. And the Gujjars and other animal husbandry, animal rearing communities, they had a exchange relationship with these settled cultivators. So when the land was lying fallow, these people would move in, and their animals would graze on the stubs. So after the harvesting was done, the stubs were left, and these stubs were grazed by these animals. They were not burnt. And so these stubs were grazed, and then the animals would also manure. Their dung used to manure these fields. And when the time came for them to move on, they moved on, and they received some grain in exchange. And while they were there, they would supply these agriculturalists with the animal products like milk and the hide of dead animals and bones and other things that are used. The kinship system or the social organization of the pastorals is usually based upon either clan or village communities. There is a reason for this. The resources that are exploited by the pastoral communities are very extensive, like pasture lands. Now, if you have to graze hundreds of animals, you need vast pasture lands. You need a lot of water. And all this cannot be owned by individuals or protected by individuals. They need to be controlled and protected by the entire community, or at least large groups, which can be lineage groups or clan groups. Clan and lineage. Lineage is where we know the known ancestor, like it would be a group comprising of 2 or 3 generations. And a clan is a very large entity which is identifies itself as descended from a mythical ancestor. Now, depending upon the extent of the resources, if they are very vast, then usually we have clans. Large communities who collectively own the land, like amongst the Nagas, amongst the Middle Eastern clansmen, the Mongols and Huns, they were all clan based. And the clan owns and protects their common resources. And all members of the clan have access to these resources by being members of that clan. So no outsider can come in and graze their animals or drink the water and do anything over there, settle down over there, because that will be all known as belonging to a particular clan who also defend it. So if outsiders come, they can be killed or chased or whatever. In case of very small communities like the Bhotiyas, they are village based. So the entire village again similarly has access to these resources. Now, for example, these the Bhotiyas who lived on the Indo-Tibet border after the 1962 war, they were shifted from the borders and their villages were located away from the borders, but they still have access to their pastoral lands because that is essential for their survival and that is something which belongs to them from generations, and the state also recognizes that right. And even today, whereas no other people can go there except for the military, the pastoral people can go there and graze their animals. For that they are given special passes. So, at the individual level, individual wealth comprises of your house, your money, your personal possessions, and even the animals. The animals are individually owned, but the pastures, water, and forest and other resources are all held collectively. It is the same for the Todas. The Todas are a smaller community occupying less bit of land, so they have lineage. About 3-4 generation depth of groups that own and manage these resources of water, forest, land, because forest is also required for their house building, for their minor forest produce, for some of the shrubs, berries, etc. that grow in the forest. So they use that. But all that belongs to the lineage. So you cannot have access to any of the resources unless you are part of that particular kinship or village group. Now, when I mentioned that pastoral economy in itself is not a complete economy. It's not a complete subsistence mode because it cannot provide the community with all that they need. They need staple food. They need other things like sugar, salt, so many other items that are required. But the pastorals produce many tradable items. Now, the Bhotiyas of Uttarakhand, for example, they trade in wool, they trade in sheep, they trade in carpets and woolen garments and some other items. But in the colonial period and in the pre-colonial period and before, in fact, right up to 1962 when the border between Tibet was closed, they used to trade across the border with Tibet. So they would carry goods from Rishikesh, from the northern Indian plains up to their village, then go across and trade with the Tibetans mainly for salt, borax and other things, and then they would come down and they would trade the same things in the markets in Rishikesh and Haridwar. So trade was a very important aspect of their economy. Then where there is the habitat is conducive or where there is no other community with which they can trade, they also have a mixed economy. Like as I said, the East African cattle belt. The Todas live in exchange relationship with other communities who live on the Nilgiri hills, and out of them the Badagas are the food producers. So shifting cultivation is a mode of cultivation that has very extensive use of land, because one piece of land is cultivated, and once the cultivation cycle is over, the stubs are burnt and they are mixed with the topsoil and the seed are broadcast. Now, this mode of cultivation does not use any external fertilizer, it does not use any mode of irrigation. So this they are rain dependent, and because they are rain dependent, not much, and because they don't dig, they don't use the plow. This is a technological aspect of shifting cultivation, that it is only done with digging sticks and hoes, and only the topsoil is turned, mostly by women. It is also called women's cultivation. It is the topsoil is turned with the burnt vegetation, and it provides the fertile soil, but only for one or maximum 2 cycles of cultivation. After that, this particular piece of land is left fallow and the people move on to another piece of land. Now, if the rainfall is sparse or it is an arid area, the fallow years will increase, so they can increase up to 10 years, which means that one piece of land is cultivated and 9 pieces of land are lying fallow, which means a very large area is lying fallow. And this can be used for grazing animals. If there is a mixed economy, they can have a exchange relationship with other communities who are pastoral, and then they can have graze the animals in exchange for various goods. So that shifting cultivation is possible with pastoral economy, and most of the time it takes place with some degree of animal husbandry, but not with pastoral economy. Now, whole of northeast of India, shifting cultivation is the primary mode of cultivation, and they depend on natural rainfall, but they only have domestication of pigs and fowl and small animals which are eaten. They're mostly for food, but animals are not domesticated as in the pastoral economies. And politically, the lineage-based organization is very compatible with both modes of cultivation, because even in shifting cultivation, there is extensive use of land. When all that land is lying fallow, it is just open for anybody to come and settle there, which means, like, I'm talking of several miles or 10, 20 miles of land that is lying fallow. So anybody can come and settle there because it appears to be abandoned, but it is not, because it is left to be used later. So here also you have the clan, lineage or village based ownership. So these resources of the land in shifting cultivation is of necessity owned by the entire community, because the entire community needs to protect that land. And usually that protection may also need a culture of warfare or conflict, like among the Naga tribes in the colonial and pre-colonial era. There was a lot of culture of conflict because they were constantly protecting their land, and they had the custom or the institution of the village dormitories, the men's dormitories. So the young men in the village would be living on the outskirts of the village, keeping an eye on who is coming and who is going, and they were constantly ready for conflict. They were armed and they were also trained. So protection of these extensive resources is a very important part of shifting cultivation. And because of their movement and because of this community ownership of land, both shifting cultivation and pastoral economies are incompatible with the centralized state. No centralized state wants either pastoral nomadic communities, or it wants shifting cultivators. There are several reasons for that. Firstly, both of these support low population densities. Now, a state gets its power from a high population density. If a sparsely populated center has very little power, then there is very little production of surplus, because both of them are what we call as subsistence economies. Subsistence economies means that whatever is produced is largely consumed or exchanged for further consumption. That is, everything is produced for use value and not for exchange value. Now, modern states are largely and predominantly based on the capitalist system of market exchange. And market exchange is incompatible with both these modes of production. And therefore, we find that the state often finds many political means of trying to say that, like we always told, that shifting cultivation is wasteful, that it is bad for the environment, or that even grazing is bad for the environment, it is bad for it causes deforestation. But these are not true, because if grazing caused deforestation or shifting cultivation was bad for the environment, they could not have continued for millions of years, which they have done. So the real reason is that they are incompatible with centralized state and capitalist economy.